Let's see. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. So tonight we have Laura and John Arnold and Professor Weston for our talk this evening. So thank you for attending this evening. My name is Diego Molina. I'm a member of Jones Partner and alumni, class of 2009, and I work for Shell. I would like to welcome our guest speakers this evening, Laura and John, as well as Professor James Weston. Thank you, Laura and John, for attending and taking the time for coming. And thank you, Professor Weston, for facilitating. I would also like to thank Jones Partners individual and corporate members, guests, Rice faculty, students, and staff. At this time, I would also like to take a moment to share the Jones Partner mission. And the mission of the Jones Partners is to open doors and build strong relationships between the Jones School and the Houston business community. The Jones Partners is a catalyst for presenting top leadership trends while connecting the business community with talent, opportunities, and knowledge. And at this moment, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the 57 Jones Partner corporate members that you'll see on the screen above us that contribute time, people, and funds to help us out. And for that, I thank them, as they do make a difference. Now to introduce Professor James Weston. James Weston, Harmon Whittington Professor of Finance at Rice Business, joined the Jones Business School faculty in 2000 after completing his PhD in economics at the University of Virginia. He has taught popular courses in economics and finance in all of Jones School programs. Professor Weston currently teaches the flagship first-year MBA core finance course for the daytime MBA program. He is the recipient of many Jones School teaching awards, including the prestigious Alumni Faculty Award that he received in 2007, 10, and 2016. James's research papers have been presented at over 30 universities worldwide, and he routinely speaks at conferences and professional seminars. So with that, I'll present Mr. Weston.
Diego, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I want to just start by thanking everybody for being here. As a finance professor, I get to talk a lot about investment. And when we talk about investment in core finance, we're usually talking about investment in fixed investment, fixed like property, plant, and equipment that companies use to sort of generate profits for their shareholders. Or we're talking about working capital investment, the money that firms need to keep going as a going concern. And tonight we get to talk about something which I don't usually get to talk about in finance course, which is investment in social capital. And so to talk about investment in social capital, we've got John and Laura Arnold here, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here tonight. I'll give you a little bit of a brief intro. John and Laura are the co-chairs of the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, which is amazing that you guys you're married and you're doing a co-chair of this foundation, which is just an outstanding social construct. The objective is to improve the lives of individuals by strengthening our social, governmental, and economic systems. Until late 2006, Laura was the executive vice president and general counsel of Cobalt International Energy here in Houston. Prior to that, she was an M&A attorney in New York. Ms. Arnold is a member of the New York Bar. She has her JD from Yale, her MPhil from Cambridge, and her BA from Harvard. I've never heard of those schools, but I'm sure they're very nice. Upon his retirement in 2012, Mr. Arnold was the founder and CEO of Centaurus Energy. And if you can't guess what that is, it's a Greek mythology name, so you can imagine it's a hedge fund. I think John was one of the people that started this, like all the hedge funds are like Greek mythology names. And John holds a BA from Vanderbilt. John is from Dallas, so a native Texan, and Ms. Arnold was born in Puerto Rico, and they live here in Houston and have 3 children. And thank you so much, John and Laura, for being here tonight to talk about the amazing things you're doing.
And if I can make one addendum,
Yeah.
Laura was also a professor at the Jones School.
That's right.
I was.
Thank you for your service.
So I'm a bit intimidated sitting between 2 professors.
Yeah, right. Well, it's really 1 1/4 professors, really.
So I think we'll just get started, and I'll ask you guys some questions and ask you guys to just sort of free-form answer it, and then at the end, we'll take some questions that people from the audience have already submitted, and we've sort of sifted through already, yeah? Okay, so you guys have set a really ambitious philanthropic goal to sort of achieve transformational change during your lifetime, which is different from a lot of other philanthropic organizations that sort of set up a charter and have a board and want to be as sort of a going concern in perpetuity. You guys have taken a different approach in sort of focusing on transformational change in your lifetime. Can you help us understand a little bit about what led you to that decision and how you sort of moved from building financial capital to assembling financial capital, giving it away through social capital? Start?
Can we start? Sure. Well, I mean, the journey, of course, is always so personal. I think that philanthropy, I think one of the great things about philanthropy is precisely that, there is no wrong answer. I mean, I think there are, as you alluded in your comments, there are foundations that are established to live in perpetuity because they believe that they want to be a resource for communities, either geographies, specific geographies. So the Houston Endowment is a great example. To some degree, I think the Brown Foundation is also similar, and they're sort of core members of society by virtue of their commitment to long-term philanthropic involvement. And I think that those are, extraordinary and admirable goals. For us, I think we were in a different position because we were fortunate enough to face these issues and to embark on this journey very early on in our lives. I mean, we were in our 30s, we were in our sort of early to mid 30s, and really started the process of introspection to really think about what do we want the next chapter of our lives to look like, and at some point, money is not what motivates you to get out of bed. At some point, you realize that you've been blessed with more than you could possibly spend, and that you have to have greater meaning in your life. That coincided with, for us, with having children and sort of having these discussions about who do we want to be, what behavior do we want to model for our children, and what legacy do we want to leave through them. And we very quickly decided that what we wanted to leave for our children was a better country than what we found, that what we were born into. And we have a personal belief that generational dynastic wealth is not what's optimal for our family. So we wanted to start this sort of journey of how do we create the change that we want to see for our children and our children's children to live in a world that's better than what it is now. And that morphed into what is now the Lauren Arnold Foundation, which we have a very hard time, honestly, explaining exactly what we do because it is policy, because it is about transformational change. It's not about bricks and mortar. It's just about improving people's lives in ways that are clear to us, but that may not lend themselves to sound bites. So it's very much about creating better policies, sort of steering government spending toward things that work and away from things that don't, and sort of shifting the culture of decision making towards something that yields better outcomes.
I'll add a couple things. I think we've been blessed with the opportunity to look at the past and see the various case studies. There's been very significant wealth in this country for over 100 years, and call it 4 generations. And so we've gotten to see, I think because we were young when we had it, we have very young children. The oldest is 10 now. It forced this introspection about what do we want for our kids, and looking at other examples and other models. And one of the things we've seen, and I want to be diplomatic about this and I hope I don't offend anybody, but and this is a generalization, right? But I think bequeathed wealth can be a burden as much as an asset. And it can change, again, for certain people. It can change motivations and ambitions. It can change the joy of earning something rather than being given it. It changes human interactions. And it can change just how you're dynamic with the world, I think. And so given that, there's a very practical matter of, we have a lot of money, and at some point we're going to die, right? So some amount's going to go to the government, and then you either bequeath it to your kids, or you give it away. And so given that, we've seen we want to give a very small amount to our kids, but most of it we want to give away. And then the question is, how do we do it? Do we do it through our will whenever we die, right? Or do we do it when we're living? And again, we've been able to see the various case studies of history. So there's been significant foundations over the past 50 years. And there's a whole books written about donor intent, where money's set up in a large foundation and an endowment, and that's managed by others. The board members are others. And the drift in donor intent. So what the person or the people, the couple that bequeath the money to the foundation, what they intended or what their beliefs were can drift over time through a foundation. And so we looked at this model, and there's books written about the drift in donor intent from the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, Fords, many others. And we thought that in order to abide by what our intent is with this money, we should spend it now. We should give it away now. I think it has the emotional appeal, right? We get much more, I think, emotional benefit of being the ones that are signing the check today rather than doing it on our deathbed. And we get to decide where it goes.
I have to say, it's like truly rewarding to hear people think so carefully and to use social science research, right? And we'll circle back to this later, your focus on sort of establishing results and causality, but to be self-introspective and to use sort of what we know about social science and cognition to think about the way that you want to do that. So, following up on that, though, the foundation does some very particular projects that have strong policy implications. And so without sort of a very large organization like the Red Cross or the United Way or something, a lot of the lean that your resources put on those policy decisions are reflecting your idiosyncratic personal views, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do you sort of make that balance, or how do you sort of hold yourselves responsible or accountable for leaning heavily on what might be a very important policy decision?
So as part of giving money away, you get a tax benefit, right? And I think there's some obligation to society whenever you take that benefit. With the tax code, with the tax cut that happened and the tax reform, one of the things that was brought up was what to do with charitable giving, right? And it ended up nothing happened, and nothing happened because every congressional district includes a hospital, university, and churches. And so it becomes very hard politically to touch. Right? If I were king of the world, or king of the United States, right, I think we should get rid of all charitable benefit, tax benefit, for charitable contributions, partly because of this issue, because trying to draw the distinction between where does our idiosyncratic beliefs start and where does societal benefit start and where does that line cross becomes almost impossible. And the government is tasked with, the IRS in practice is tasked with trying to figure that out. And so you have these legal entities of the 501c3, the 501c4, which is for advocacy and does not get a tax deduction, and then political giving generally through PACs. You have these different entities. The problem is that you have very gray areas in this, right? And the IRS, got into a bit of a scandal maybe 6 or 8 years ago, trying to figure out, as people were pushing the line on what the difference between a C3 and a C4 was, and the C3 is your typical nonprofit, and a C4 is one that advocates for policy change and does not have that tax advantage deduction. And it became political, and the IRS just threw up their hands. It would be easier if we could just make nothing tax deductible. Now, I say that because there is this aspect. I think we do have a responsibility, because we are getting this tax benefit, to do something for society. Right? And so we have to always have this bogey or this hurdle of, we could give our money to the government. And we're not anti-government people. I think the government, if you think about collectively what government does, it funds medical care, funds education, funds military, funds police, funds pensions. That's most of the money. 95% of money goes to that. Right? So those it has a broad or intersection with what a lot of philanthropy or charities do. And so that could always be our default, is to give the money to government. And so we have to use that as an internal hurdle on our work, is can we do something better with that than what the government should do with it? And that led us to, it's one of the reasons that led us to, can we use that money to try to address what we think are some of the market failures or problems associated with our democracy, try to make government more efficient and financially cost sustainable.
Or do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think that.
Okay. So I guess let's talk about some specifics of what the foundation does. When I think about sort of broad philanthropic giving, I think often my mind goes immediately to
Gifts to Rice.
yeah,
of course.
gifts to rice. It doesn't. That's
First and foremost.
Peter's and Bill's job. That's not my job.
Chair endowment?
I think of lots of other things to do. No, but it might go. But I might think immediately across the street to MD Anderson, or I might think about people under very, very serious emotional distress somewhere in the world under some very bad circumstances, institutionally or economically. But you guys took up pension reform in Houston, which is an unusual target for philanthropic support. Can you talk a little bit about that example and why you chose it and what your objectives were?
The pension reform work, which we've been involved in for probably almost 10 years now, is far beyond Houston. I mean, this was an issue that is an issue we've been involved in numerous jurisdictions all over the country. But you're right to point out that not very many philanthropists enter this kind of space, and it's and you can psychoanalyze this ad nauseum. I mean, part of it is it's much easier to contribute to a building, right? To bricks and mortar, it's easier to see the results of your contributions, or to a scholarship, or there are a lot of equally important and easier sort of to grapple with ways of spending philanthropic capital. With the pensions example specifically, as John noted, we try very hard to focus on very difficult systemic issues in our country. We like to talk about them, we think about them in terms of market inefficiencies. Some sort of imbalance in markets that is yielding a suboptimal outcome for society. Pensions is a perfect example of that. And in fact, unlike many other issues that we focus on, pensions is actually a very simple problem to define. It's not an easy problem to fix, but it's a very easy problem to define. It's a math problem, right? You owe X, and you have 10% of X, and so there you go. That's the issue, and the gap seems to be growing unless we change the behavior. And now you can test assumptions. You can take issue with certain, at the margin with certain assumptions that you made in those calculations. But essentially, it's a math problem, right? And it yields very difficult policy debates. But it is something that we noted 10 years ago and continue to believe threatens the fiscal sustainability of every jurisdiction that is facing these crises. In many jurisdictions that are, many cities and many states, it really threatens the fiscal viability of the entire, of the entire population, and it makes communities have to make really significant trade-offs. Do we satisfy our pension obligation, or do we hire police officers? Do we hire teachers? Do we close libraries? Do we, and the list goes on and on and on, right? I mean, there's some real trade-offs that you have to make if the vast majority or a significant proportion of the capital that you have available to you goes towards satisfying pension obligations that should never have been made in the first place, right? So we became interested in this issue not because we had an agenda of what the right answer needed to be, but because we thought it was important for communities to understand the problem. So a lot of the work initially, and still, is really transparency work, is understanding and shedding light on the magnitude of the issue. what will happen if what is the status quo now? What will happen if the city of Chicago or the state of Illinois or the city of Houston does not address this pension crisis? What are things going to look like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What's the likelihood that the city will be able to meet its pension obligations 20 years from now? And what does that mean for somebody who's relying on that pension to retire? Right? So we do a lot of education work in that sense, just really relaying the facts. And we've become a resource, I like to think, for communities to ask questions. So how can we address this issue? What would happen if we changed the cost of living adjustment, if we tweaked it, or what would happen if we shifted people from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan? Or, what are the options that we have, and what are the trade-offs and implications of each of these options? And so we don't necessarily assert a view over and above simply stating the facts of what the consequences are of everything from inaction to aggressive action. So that's something that for us is a very natural place to work. An area in which we see a market failure. We believe that we have the expertise and the ability to shed light on an issue and move a policy discussion forward. We believe there's political opportunity because people are understanding the magnitude of these issues and are understanding the need to act. So there's bipartisan interest in collaborating to arrive at a solution. But those are the areas that we really like to work in, where we can see an end result, we can see communities agreeing on the importance of an issue, and we can see a path to success.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, as Laura was saying, we get drawn to these issues that have the market failure. One of the market failures that we often see is the concentrated benefit diffuse costs issue. And you see that in much of government where the payer, at the end of the day, is a taxpayer, right? And for most people, it's a very small amount of money. In aggregate, it's significant. But because it's concentrated benefits, you get these special interests. And they become too powerful and not a proper counterweight on the other side. And so in much of the work, we view ourselves as being a counterweight to special interests, whether in any area we work in, there's often some type of special interest. Now, when you start kicking that cat, it fights back. Right? And it can be, it's tough. I've had vicious things written about me, right? And I'm somewhat an easy target. I worked at Enron and made a lot of money, and the company I worked at went bankrupt, right? And so it's an easy target to have a soundbite that's negative against me, and people have taken advantage of it. And when we look at what's our market opportunity, I'll try to use business terms since we're in the Jones School. What's our market opportunity of giving, and what's the supply of giving or philanthropic money versus the demand? And one of the things we found that was unmet was being this counterweight in policy areas. One, for several reasons. One, we're young. Right? This work you don't get change in 6 months in it. Your building doesn't get built, your policy building doesn't get built in 6 months, right? The policy work takes a long time. Second is we are willing to, and have the ability to dedicate our lives to it. So this is our full-time job. And I think that's a necessary condition to be successful in this work. It's hard to outsource it. And third, we don't have business interests that we need to protect. So we talk to a lot of people who have interest in some of the areas that we work in, whether it's criminal justice or education, pensions, any type of government financial sustainability. And whenever they're trying to protect their business interests, they're very limited as what they can do. A great example of when Mark Zuckerberg gave $100 million very publicly to Newark to help reform their school system, and the pushback that he got back structurally changed his giving going forward. Because he has a fiduciary responsibility to his shareholders, and he can't be, in his personal side, be causing bad press for Facebook. So we don't have those interests that we're trying to protect, and so that's an advantage that we have. And so it allows us to try to combat some of these special interests. And I think our personalities are such that we're willing to take that abuse, which can be tough. It was a learning curve to get to that point, for sure. But kind of that market opportunity for us, we've kind of found that there's unmet demand to be that counterweight in policy arguments.
That's wonderful. I love the pension reform issue because it's such a wonderful example for my economics and finance students of opportunity cost, where every dollar you save, the government, that is a dollar that could be used by the government to do all of the other things that we give philanthropic support for, that solve the other market failures that we're solving as an opportunity cost through the pension reform. So let's talk about another topic that you guys have taken that's, again, I think a somewhat strange topic for philanthropy, which is this focus on causal inference, which is something that's really close to my heart as well. We see so much, I'll use the phrase that's common right now, fake research, where people come out with research studies that are really serving just, either they're very shallow and not very well supported, or they're representing some framing problem in the researcher's mind. And the fact that a philanthropist would A, identify that this is even a thing, and then B, think to themselves, how would we change the way scientific research is done? Can you speak to that issue a little bit?
So when we decided to get really serious about giving away money during our lifetime, we thought it would be easy. And I thought, right, we'll find the 5 most effective social programs and go write some big checks. And so we kind of went on this journey. Let's go figure out what those 5 most effective programs are. And started really digging into the research and getting into the journals and reading studies. And one thing we found very quickly was that the more you read, the less you knew. Because when you read these studies, and then you went one step further and read the critique of these studies, and then the rejoinder to the critique, and then it went on forever, and at the end, I'm pulling my hair out, because I don't know what to believe.
Thank you for looking at my research. I really appreciate it.
But you were the last word, right?
That's right.
I think the finance industry, which I come from, tackled these problems relatively early. And that's because there was so much data that was collected in finance that you could find any type of pattern you wanted, right? You could start, if you just went data mining, you could find patterns. And the finance industry learned very quickly that without going through the scientific process, just finding data patterns would not lead to profitable trades in the future. And through a process of iteration and trial and error, the finance industry was forced to figure this out because this is a pattern that should work. I can't understand why it's not, right? Oh, scientific method. I have to have a hypothesis about why this should be happening, and then I test it. And what happened, I think, was that 2 things. One is science had gotten sloppy. So the science of the academic science had just gotten sloppy, where all the incentives in the system, whether from funders, from universities, especially for professors, and from the journals, was about developing novel results. So the thing that was an interesting result would get press, it would help the professor get tenure, it would get press for the university, it would sell journals, all the things. Everybody was incentivized for more novel results. There was no incentive for figuring out what was actually correct. There were a few guys that were working off on the side who were given no credit, but the system wasn't designed that way. And then the second, so you had the sloppiness, and then you had the problem with research that was designed by advocates and executed by advocates that was getting equal weight by policymakers as the really well-designed research. So we started kind of this whole line of work after getting really frustrated trying to use research to shape our funding of how do we improve the scientific process within universities.
So drill down on that a little bit more for me. So what are some ideas about how you might, how you think you might improve that, or what you think, just even in the most general sense, what do you think are some of the major levers that draw incentives in the wrong place?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in the research community, so in the academic research community, there's a set of issues. In the policy-making community, there's another set of issues. So I'll start with the latter. In the policy-making community, I think that the real challenge is that the sad fact is that most social programs don't work, right? Because it's very difficult to alter human behavior. Right? But there is a pot of money that the government seeks to spend on everything from homelessness to housing to social services to education. So the money is channeled in ways that are dictated by intuition and not evidence. And when you really drill down and figure out what works, the universe is actually quite small. I mean, we all know, I see many faces in the room that are very familiar to me on education work. I mean, we've all been through this, and we all know that many programs simply don't get the results unless you draw some inferences that are not scientific, right? Unless you lower the bar and start attributing much more value to observations and abandon, and trust correlations and abandon the fealty to causation. And I think that from a policymaker perspective has become much more prevalent. So making judgments on anecdotes is a real problem in social policy. And a lot, billions of dollars are allocated to programs that are ineffective. And so part of our interest in this work is to, or part of the work that we're doing in that area, is to engage policymakers and federal agencies, state agencies, government agencies, into caring about the evidence and into thinking about what is it about the social program that I think is valuable and not valuable. What evidence can I point to determine that this allocation, of millions of dollars to this homelessness program is actually the best way to spend government resources? And to do that, we have established a number of what we call policy labs, which are research partnerships from among governments, universities, and practitioners to start drilling at these questions. And the hope is that if a state or the federal government has an interest in these issues and has questions, that there is a resource for them to get answers in terms of what does and doesn't work. By conducting randomized controlled trials, by conducting quasi-experimental experiments, et cetera. So that work, so a lot of the work on the policymaking side is focused on creating these policy labs all over the country, and we have now, I think, 7 of them, maybe 9, something like that, throughout the country, the most established of which is in Rhode Island, and which is doing terrific work. And engaging federal government agencies in conducting more randomized controlled trials. So we do a lot of work on the supply side, on figuring out, on sorting through the research and understanding what is good research and what is not good research, and really just getting a handle on what do we know about social programs. We have a team that does nothing but randomized controlled trial review. They look at every single social science study that is published, and they make a judgment about it and understand whether or not it's a high quality study or not, and whether or not we're advancing our knowledge in a particular field as a result of that study. So that's on the policy making side. On the academic institution side, to be honest, it's a much harder question, right? Because the incentive system is so broken, as John noted. At every step of the chain, if you will, the incentives are broken, and researchers, who are obviously not bad people, are incentivized to stash away bad results and only talk about their successes. So
I feel that day to day. So I genuinely do.
Yeah.
Well, I made tenure here at Rice by getting a certain number of publications.
That's exactly
on
right.
my vita, but not by establishing
Right.
a certain set of truths.
So if you have so if you truly want to answer a question as to whether or not M&Ms cause cancer, right? And you conduct your study and you find out that purple M&Ms don't cause cancer. No one cares about that result. Nobody cares that purple M&Ms don't cause cancer. But if you conduct the exact same experiment 19 other times, and on time number 20, you find some correlation, some publication is going to publish that study. And they don't care about the 19 other times when you did the exact same thing and failed. They just care about the one time when you got the outcome that's flashy. And that's on all of us. That's on each one of us who reads the New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and says, oh, this study says that caffeine, that caffeine causes heart disease, or red wine causes whatever. I mean, we've all seen this, right? And we've all fallen for it at some level, right? Because reporters report on bad science that is published by journals that don't have sufficiently high standards, because universities incentivize professors to only report on splashy results, and that's a problem.
I've got 6 colors of M&Ms, so I'll find one of them can cause
That's right.
cancer.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so
One of
this
them,
is
one of them will do the trick.
That's
Some
right.
type of cancer. You
Yeah.
get
Some
20 different
kind
types
of,
of
yeah,
cancers.
And
So
then
there's this,
my deans and the administrators will get all excited, and it'll get published, and I'll get notoriety for it.
That's right. And
yeah.
so it's very hard. So your question was, what are we doing about it? And the short answer is, it's extremely difficult to tackle this problem. We seeded an organization called the Center for Open Science, which is starting the threshold work that's extremely important to start addressing this problem. So for example, one of the problems, as you probably well know, is that a researcher can start conducting a series of research and can find outcomes that he or she didn't expect, and then sort of say, oh yeah, that's what I was looking for in the beginning. That's what I meant. It wasn't, I thought I was looking for, a correlation between purple M&Ms, red M&Ms, and cancer, but actually, no, I was looking at the correlation between sugar and cancer. That's very different, right? So part of the effort of the Center for Open Science is to make researchers, or encourage researchers, to pre-register their studies. So tell me at the beginning what you are seeking to do and what your hypothesis is. Share your data so that people can question your methodology. Share your hypotheses, share your experiments, so that the entire process is transparent. That piece in and of itself, we think is very meaningful. We've had a relative amount of success getting journals to force, or to incentivize researchers to pre-register their studies before they would be accepted to publication. So things like that, things like pre-registration and transparency and open data, we think are very, very good first steps that are necessary.
I love that idea. I love the idea of pre-registering the idea. And I'm completely on board with continuing to get paid for not publishing, as long as my studies are correct.
But so another thing we're doing in the academic research environment is trying to incentivize a lot of academics to replicate studies.
Yeah.
So if you found something amazing about the red M&Ms, you should be able to reproduce that piece of research, right? But nobody wants to challenge the preeminent professor. There's no glory in that, right? But it's very important. It's very important for research to be replicated so that we can challenge and see whether or not this was a one-off affair. So we did in research circles, fairly well-known study in psychology that was we called the Reproducibility Project, where we sought to replicate, how many studies?
100.
100 of the most prominent psychology studies of all time. Only about 40% of them could be replicated. And the number may have been lower than that.
Yeah, 30-something.
30-something percent of them. Everything else couldn't be replicated. And it caused a huge splash in the research community, in the psychology research community, and lots of haters, right, saying that there are lots of reasons why it couldn't be replicated and whatever else. And so there were lots of rejoinders and lots of vibrant and important arguments about this. But the point is that there is no glory in replicating research that's accepted and that's just commonly perceived to be true, and there's no reason for that. Science is about inquiry, and it's about challenge, and it's about truth-seeking. And if we all take a snapshot of one study as truth, then we are not embracing science.
And I go back to what Laura was talking about our work on policy labs and about policy experimentation. And if you look at almost any Fortune 500 company now, particularly ones that are consumer-facing, this concept of A/B testing is just embedded in them, right? Of experimentation. You go to Facebook or Google, they're conducting hundreds of tests a day. Now, it's very easy for them to say, well, put this ad in orange and this ad in red and give it to 5,000 people in the next 30 minutes and see how many clicks we get. And 99-point-something% of them, don't reject the null hypothesis. There's a failed test, but they do enough of them, and they keep having these small iterations on their programs, on their program delivery, if you will, that it leads to better and better products. And if you think about government's almost the opposite. It is the experimentation that happens within a government is very light. The experimentation that happens at the government level tends to be, we have the advantage of the federalist system of government. So we have 50 states all conducting, little experiments. Colorado decides it wants to legalize marijuana, right? And every other state can look at it and see what the repercussions are, and so you have that type of experiment happening. So you have some of these big policy changes that are happening, and states get to look at one another and see what's working, what doesn't. What you don't have much of is, should we be using this curriculum or that curriculum? Which job training program should we be using and sending people to? Or what are the aspects of job training programs that are successful? And so this can be done through randomized controlled trials. Now, it costs almost nothing for Facebook to do that. It's expensive, very expensive for researchers to do that with government programs for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. But one of the goals of the policy labs is to try to aggregate all this data to greatly bring down the cost for researchers to do these experiments and try to look at data, whether it's natural experiments or whether it's randomized controlled trials, of trying to figure out which aspects of program delivery in government are more effective.
No, that's wonderful. So since we've sort of gone through some examples, give us a sense. You guys have got another, let's say, 50 years to see your sort of these transformational investments bear dividends down the road. How do you measure, and how do you think about benchmarking sort of whether you're doing a good job, or whether this, if you're looking at 10 different things, ultimately you've got to start making some portfolio choices, right? The finance guy's going to put things in these terms. How do you think about trading off sort of risk and reward, or thinking about whether or not it's yielding what you thought it was, or shifting funds away from one thing and into another? How do you make those sort of decisions?
Yeah. This is the hardest aspect of our work, is that when we talk about trying to do experiments and fund what works within government and try and use that same philosophy for our own work. And the problem is that the feedback loop on policy change is extraordinarily slow. It's often extraordinarily slow. And so there's an example I tell. There's a book written by an advocate, a gay rights advocate, who wanted to get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and wanted to allow gays to serve openly in the military. And he went through a 15-year process to get that policy overturned. And regardless of whether, what your personal view is on it, this was his policy view, and he got to success. The first 10 years of that, the benchmarks that he had were, the visible success or tangible success of that work was extraordinarily slow. It was, I got to talk to a lieutenant at West Point. Right? I got to do, I held this seminar someplace. Right? I got a conversation with a general, and it was this, almost the snowball of trying to get it started was really slow in building it up. And it would have been very easy 5 years in to say, I'm making very little progress on this. I'm going to stop. It's just not working. I'm not getting traction, and I'm going to go move my resources to some other problem. But he stuck with it, and he got to what he defined his success to be. Right? And so when we're looking at our work, some things we have shorter-term wins. On other things, it is we go into it knowing that there's not going to be a short-term win, and medium-term movement and tangible success will be difficult. So how do we judge our own efforts, and how do we allocate our resources, our human and financial resources amongst problems? We found it to be really hard. So part of it is, can we see that little snowball rolling? Can we start having some little signs of success, knowing that in all likelihood, the things we're working on, the majority of them probably we're not going to get success as we define it. Right? So we have to start off with working on very large problems, because if our probability of success on any given problem is small, then whenever we have success, it better be for something significant. And so part of it is, how do we choose the issues to begin with? And that's why we've led us to education and criminal justice and financial sustainability and healthcare, electoral reform, higher ed. So these things that are really big problems for the country, and then hopefully, right, if we get success on one of them, right, then we can deem it to be success. But.
And I'd add that I think an additional challenge for us is that in every one of our issue areas and in every one of our lines of work, the levers for change are different. Some lines of work are purely an inside game of elites, right? You influence policymakers, you influence sort of bureaucrats, technocrats, if you will. Others are very much have a grassroots component and very much have a demand side challenge. And one of the challenges for us is to really understand what the levers are for each of our lines of work, and are we best positioned to pull on those levers in the most effective way, understanding that they're different in every single case. And I mean, we have varying degrees of success and sophistication in those, and hopefully we'll get better. But that's one of the challenges that we're constantly grappling with.
Good. I've got a couple of questions that have come from audience members.
Great.
And we've sort of screened them out. What's your screening process to determine
The questions?
Yeah, I know my screening process.
Yeah.
What's your screening process? Just in sort of the largest sense. I'm sure there's a hierarchy of screening that you do. What's the gist of how a project finally gets green-lighted for you?
You're talking a specific project or a area of focus?
No, a specific project.
Yeah, that's maybe we'll answer the area of focus question and then maybe sort of drill into the specific project piece, because this is, the reason John is pausing is that this is kind of an ongoing conversation as, frankly, as the foundation expands and our role as founders shifts a bit. Because we've expanded significantly in the last couple of years. We have an absolutely stellar team. So at some level, we grapple with the questions of how much involvement do we have versus how much runway do people have. But in terms of the lines of work, I think that we have in our head sort of very specific filters about the things that we're interested in. So is it a large systemic problem? Is it rooted in a fundamental market inefficiency, whether it's an imbalance of resources, an imbalance of political power? Is it something that philanthropy is best positioned to address effectively? Not every problem is a problem that philanthropy can solve or that can seek to solve. So is philanthropy best positioned to address it and to contribute to the discussion? Are we as philanthropists best positioned to address it and contribute to the discussions? We are not involved in cancer research because we are not scientists, and we have nothing to add other than resources and entrusting somebody else to do the right thing, which is extraordinarily important, but that's not how we work. So is it something that's within our field of expertise where we think we as an organization have the skill set and the bandwidth and the resources to add value? Can we define specific policy objectives? So can we define the problem sufficiently narrowly where we can think about alternatives that we'd like to test? So is this an area where we think there's a need for innovation? Do we think we can create those alternatives and test them? Can we at least articulate some possibilities for policy change that we think are feasible? Right? So those are the kinds of things that we think of on the front end to think about whether or not we want to play in a specific field. So criminal justice, as John mentioned, education, pension reform, fiscal sustainability, those are issues where we feel that we can really and truly add value given our skill set, and where we think that philanthropy can be a laboratory for change that can be additive to government and that can allow governments to take risks.
Yeah, I'll answer it a little bit from the program side, and just as from what the foundation, the filters that we look at for deciding to fund a specific program, and there's a lot, but I'll mention two of them. One is it scalable? And so with that, it's let me start with a different one, which is will we know success? Right. So if we're funding a project that's an experiment or someone wants to run a different policy, a state wants to try a different way to address a problem, is there a way for us to know at the end of that whether that's a better answer or not? And it's oftentimes when you're dealing with social problems, sometimes they're very measurable and quantifiable, and sometimes they're not. And so that has to be, at the end of it, are we going to know something as a field? Right? And second is, if it is successful, is it scalable? And generally with two criteria. One is it financially viable? And the truth is that most jurisdictions and states have tight budgets. So if the answer is one that is just throw more money at the problem, it's likely to be fragile. And the next recession that hits, everything that was implemented as process or policy is just going to get reversed. So that's fragile, it's not scalable. Right? And the second is the key man problem associated with it. So we find a lot is a social program that works at small scale. Right? And when you try to scale it, it doesn't work. And you can think about a restaurant. Right? We have one restaurant works. When they try to go from one restaurant to 10 restaurants, it doesn't work because the key to that one restaurant succeeding is the great chef or the owner, the person, the maitre d' who's there. It is specific to not just the menu and the prices and the food. It is also dependent upon the people who are within the restaurant. And so you see this in social programs that it might just be one very charismatic and dynamic program leader. Right? And that person is necessary for this thing to scale. So when we look at it is this the type of program that if it is successful at the pilot level, is it something that can scale? And is it something that will become embedded as policy or process? Or is it the next time the next superintendent that comes in is going to install his program? And there's this, we've had superintendent change in Houston, right? When Terry Greer was here and he installed the Apollo 20, right? And then Carranza came in and he kind of got rid of much of that and installed Achieve 180. Right? And then he was here for 18 months, and then the next person comes in and he's going to do Advantage 24/7, or whatever it is. Right? And so those programs at the ISD level are often dependent upon the key man of superintendent, and it's not embedded. Yeah, it's not institutionalized. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has been the hardest for us to grapple with is maintaining fealty to that model. So understanding that we are a policy foundation that seeks to achieve change through policy, and that creating, sort of being loyal to that mission requires you to not invest in a lot of things that are extremely important, and sort of there are some very important policy-related endeavors that simply just fall away, right? Because they don't have passive sustainability, because they would rely on philanthropy, just by definition, right? And we've had conversations with the example I'm thinking of now is investigative reporting, which is extremely important to all of us as a society, right? To have the economics of the newspaper business now are particularly challenging. Investigative reporting is falling away, and we all suffer from it. But if you talk to investigative reporting institutions, they have no sustainability pathway, and their answer is, you need to look at us like you look at the opera, like you look at museums, right? We are a cultural and established institution that necessarily relies on philanthropy. And unless you recognize us as that, unless you elevate us to the level of a cultural institution in our museum, This is not going to be a sustainable endeavor for society. And that's a very challenging approach for us, right?
So one of my questions is specific, and so I'd like to get to it. How did you get involved in bail reform in Harris County? This is another one that's like really kind of like really in the weeds that you wouldn't sort of identify. I love the example. And how do you think it's progressing? Like, how do you think it's going? So I think tell people that might not know about your efforts in bail reform.
Sure. Well, we started our work in criminal justice very early on at the foundation. And the first thing that we did, because we recognized that we knew very little, we had a great passion, but we needed to gather information to assert a view as to sort of how we wanted to shape the portfolio. We took about a year and a half, truly a year and a half, to think, along with our team, about what areas of criminal justice we thought were the most ripe for change. And one of the things that very quickly emerged from that research was that millions and millions and millions of people on any given day are in jails. They're in county jails or in city jails, simply awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted. So not in state prisons, so I'm talking about like the Harris County Jail, so county jails or city jails. They're incarcerated in jails, simply awaiting trial. And you might wonder, well, why is it? And it's because they can't make bail. So just a very, very quick overview of the process. When and if you get arrested, right? When and if you get arrested, you get stopped. The police officer says, I'm hauling you to jail for whatever. But let's say possession of cocaine or something like that. So you get booked, and at some point you get arraigned before a judge. And I'll call it a judge. It could be magistrate. It could be some administrative person, but some judicial body. And that person looks at you and says, John Arnold, right? It has very, very few data points right in front of him or her, the judge, and says, all right, bail is set at $10,000. Your trial date is September 28th. Right? Today is what, March, whatever today is. So in some time in the future, sometime significantly in the future, your trial date is set, and that is the point at which you will be tried and found innocent or guilty, right? So until that point, we live in a system where you're innocent until proven guilty. We've all learned this in civics class. So the question is, what happens to John at that point? Well, bail is set at $10,000. If you live in a place like Harris County, let's say, you can go to bail bondsman, who will charge you 10%. So what did I say, $10,000, $1,000, let's say $1,000, right? So, okay, so bail is set at $1,000. So does John have $100 to give to the bail bondsman to buy his freedom? And very often, the defendant doesn't. So John has $1,000, and so he'll give $10,000 or whatever it is. He'll walk away, he'll show up, maybe, September 28th. We have no idea whether he'll show up, but he paid the money, right? So that's how the system deals with it. So why is it that these millions of people are in jail? Who do we think these people are who are in jail awaiting trial? They're the people who don't have $100. They don't have 10% of the bail money. So they sit in jail from today until September 28th, awaiting trial. So what happens? What can we assume? What can we infer about somebody who doesn't have $100, or call it $500 or $1,000, to pay for his or her freedom? Well, we can assume that that person is living paycheck to paycheck. We can assume that person has, unstable employment, maybe unstable family situations. So what have we done? Well, we can at very least assume that that person lives paycheck to paycheck. So what have we done to this person as a society by locking her up in jail for 6 months? Well, she's lost her job. If she has kids, she's lost her kids. Right? She's lost her housing because she can't pay rent. So is that person more or less likely to commit a crime in the future? Right? So this struck us as just a uniquely bad idea, right, as a society, and a uniquely bad way to spend government resources by incarcerating this person. So what we did was, understanding this problem, we went about creating a risk assessment tool that would be a resource for that judge. So at the time when John is before the magistrate or before the judge, that person, that judge would have a risk score in front of her that would say, okay, John Arnold, he's a very low risk of recidivism, and he's a very low risk of failing to appear. So those are the only two things we should care about, because the person is innocent until proven guilty in our system. So we should only care about, is John going to show up at trial on September 28th, and is John going to do anything bad between now and September 28th? Everything else is great. So we believe that John's ability to pay $100 or $1,000 doesn't indicate anything about his likelihood of showing up at trial or his likelihood of recidivating. In fact, organized crime members can pay the bail no problem, and they're very dangerous people. So so in any event, we developed this risk assessment tool that is meant to be a resource for judges to understand the risk of each individual, so that judges don't automatically set fixed money bail schedules for people who don't have the money to pay bail, so we don't ruin people's lives. Communities are arguably safer than they were before, because you are releasing people who are nonviolent and who are low risk, and you are remanding to jail people who are either high risk of failing to appear or dangerous people. And we believe that that's a more cost-effective and better solution for society. So Harris County was one of the jurisdictions in probably our third or fourth wave of jurisdictions that expressed interest in adopting our risk assessment tool. So Harris County has adopted our risk assessment tool, not without challenges that are independent of the risk tool, that are more sort of reflective of politics in Harris County. But the main objective of our work is to address this, what we view as an inefficiency in the criminal justice system, in incarcerating low-income, largely minority defendants for no reason other than the fact that they don't have $100 or $1,000. So, thank you.
I think our time has sort of drawn to a close, Laura and John. I want to thank you. It really is personally delighting to me when a philanthropist will say, I want to use the tools of social science that have been brought to us to take those tools to social science questions. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing your time with us at the Jones School tonight. I think, Diego, you have a little gift. Yeah. This is
Well, thank you so much for
our
having
philanthropic
us.
support of the Arnolds.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there's a reception afterwards, and
Yep,
at the
and we'll make
Anderson
it to
Family
the
Commons, yeah. I
Anderson
hope to see
Family.
everybody there. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, guys. That was really fun.